The dust was a living thing. It coated the tongue, settled in the lungs, and drew a gritty veil across the sun, turning the light a weary, jaundiced yellow. It rose from the shuffling feet of men whose faces were hard maps of cruelty and want, their eyes fixed on the crude wooden platform where she stood. She was a curiosity, a piece of unclaimed property to be disposed of. The heat pressed down, a physical weight that mirrored the crushing weight of their stares. She felt less than human, a collection of parts to be appraised. Teeth for soundness, hips for childbearing, hands for labor. Her own hands were bound loosely with a length of rough twine that chafed her wrists, a final, redundant indignity. There was nowhere to run. The world had shrunk to this dusty patch of hell, the final stop on a long, brutal journey that had stripped her of everything, even her name. Fear had been her companion for so long, it was a hollow ache in her bones. But here, on this block, it sharpened into a blade of pure terror. The auctioneer, a man with a sweat-stained collar and a voice like gravel grinding, began his spiel. He spoke of her as one might speak of livestock, detailing her potential for work and obedience. Each word was a small death. Her gaze drifted past him, over the leering, hungry faces, and snagged on one in particular. Silas Croft, a man whose reputation for casual cruelty was a whispered legend in every saloon and settlement. He was smiling, a wet, predatory curve of his lips, and his eyes roamed over her with an air of ownership that made her stomach clench. He would buy her. The certainty of it was a cold stone in her gut. He would take her to his squalid homestead and break her, just as he broke his horses and his hounds. The bidding started low, a few coins tossed out like insults. Her price was a measure of her worthlessness. Croft let the lesser men have their sport, his confidence a palpable, suffocating force. Then he made his bid, his voice thick with satisfaction, silencing the others. It was done. The auctioneer looked ready to call her sold, his gavel hand already twitching. She closed her eyes, a silent prayer forming on her lips, not for salvation, but for a quick end. And then another voice cut through the air. $100. It was not loud, but it had the solid, unyielding quality of bedrock. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. She opened her eyes. Leaning against a support post at the very back of the crowd was a man she hadn't noticed before. He was tall and broad, dressed not in the dusty finery of the town's merchants, but in the worn, practical clothes of a rancher. His face was weathered by sun and wind, stark and unreadable, and his eyes, clear and gray as a winter sky, were fixed not on her, but on the auctioneer. A stillness had fallen over the square. $100 was a fortune, an absurd price for a nameless, destitute girl. Silas Croft's face purpled with rage. He spat a curse into the dust and doubled his bid. The rancher didn't hesitate. 200, his voice remained level, devoid of passion or competition. It was the flat, final sound of closing door. Croft sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, but he was finished. He didn't have that kind of money, and no one else would dare challenge such a price. The auctioneer, stunned into silence for a moment, finally found his voice. Sold, he croaked, his gavel falling with a hollow thud that echoed the frantic beating of her heart. Sold to Jedediah Kalin. The name meant nothing to her, but the shocked and resentful murmurs that swept through the crowd told her everything she needed to know. This man, Kalin, was an outsider, an enigma. And now, for the price of $200, she belonged to him. The journey from the town was cloaked in a profound and unnerving silence. Jedediah Kalin untied the twine from her wrists with a simple, decisive pull, his fingers brushing against her skin for a fleeting moment. The touch was impersonal, practical, yet it sent a tremor of shock through her. He gestured toward a sturdy buckboard wagon, its bed laden with sacks of flour and salt, and watched as she climbed aboard. He did not help her, nor did he rush her. He simply waited, his patience as vast and unnerving as the landscape that was beginning to unfold around them. As the wagon rumbled out of the settlement, she could feel the town's collective stare like a brand on her back. She did not look back. There is nothing there to see but the end of one kind of misery and the beginning of another, unknown. She sat rigidly on the hard wooden seat, her hands clenched in her lap, stealing glances at the man beside her. He held the reins with an easy, capable grip. His profile was stark against the endless sky, a sharp jawline shadowed by several days of growth, a straight nose, a brow that seemed permanently fixed in a state of solemn contemplation. He did not speak. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves, and the sigh of the wind across the immense, empty plains. The land was terrifying in its scope. It stretched out in every direction, a rolling sea of brown grass and bruised purple shadows under a sky so big it seemed to have no end. There were no trees, no landmarks, just the relentless, featureless expanse. It felt like an exile. She had been bought by a silent man and taken to the edge of the world. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and red, a chill seeped into the air. She shivered, her thin dress offering no protection. Without a word, Jedediah reached behind the seat and pulled out a thick wool blanket. It smelled faintly of horse and clean earth. He handed it to her, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. She hesitated for a moment, suspicion warring with the biting cold, then took it, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a small, shocking comfort in the midst of her fear. It was an act of consideration, not kindness, the sort of practical care one might give to a valuable animal one had just purchased. Still, it was more than she had known for a very long time. They traveled for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the encroaching twilight. Just when she thought they might travel on through the entire night, a dark shape materialized in the distance. A homestead. It was not a sprawling, prosperous ranch, but a small, solid-looking house, a sturdy barn, and a web of corrals, all huddled together, as if for protection against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. This was his home, her new prison. He brought the wagon to a halt near the house and climbed down. For a moment, she remained seated, paralyzed by a fresh wave of fear. This was it. The door would close behind her, and her fate would be sealed. Jedediah Kalen walked around to her side of the wagon and simply stood there, waiting. He did not order her down. He did not reach for her. He just waited, his silent patience a more powerful command than any shouted order. Gathering the last of her courage, she slid down from the seat, her legs unsteady on the solid ground. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if acknowledging a transaction was complete, and then turned toward the dark, silent house. He led her inside. The house was dark, but he moved with the easy familiarity of a man who knew the placement of every object by heart. He lit a single kerosene lamp on a simple wooden table, and the room flickered into view. It was a main room, spare and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace stood cold and silent against one wall, flanked by a single, well-worn armchair. The floors were swept, the few pieces of furniture free of dust. It was a space of stark functionality, devoid of any softness or personal touch, yet lacked the grime and squalor she had been steeling herself for. He gestured toward a closed door. "This is yours," he said. His voice, when he finally used it, was low and rough, as if from disuse. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He merely nodded at the door again before turning away. "There's water in the pitcher on the stand." He walked back to the front door, pausing with his hand on the latch. The door does not lock from the outside. And then he was gone, pulling the front door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the lamplight. She stood frozen for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on her. Slowly, she made her way to the indicated door and pushed it open. The room was small, containing only a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small wooden stand with a pitcher and basin, and a single window looking out onto the immense, dark plains. It was a cell, but a clean one. A bed, but a solitary one. The meaning of his words began to sink in, confusing and contradictory. The door does not lock from the outside. He had paid a fortune for her, and now he was leaving her to her own devices, granting her a privacy she could not fathom. A short while later, she heard the scrape of something against her door. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. But the sound receded, followed by the sound of the front door opening and closing again. After several minutes of strained listening, she crept to the door and opened it crack. On the floor sat a metal tray with a hunk of bread, a piece of cheese, and a tin cup of water. He had left her food. He was in the barn or somewhere outside, leaving her completely alone in his house. Sleep was impossible. She lay on the narrow bed, fully clothed, the wool blanket clutched to her chest, listening. The house groaned around her. The wind howled a low, mournful song against the window pane. Every sound was a potential threat, but the threat never came. The silence was broken only by the vast, lonely sounds of the prairie night. Dawn arrived not with a gentle light, but with a sharp, gray clarity that laid the world bare. Exhausted, but driven by a gnawing uncertainty, she rose and left the small room. The main room was empty. Through the front window, she could see him in the distance, a solitary figure already at work, mending a section of fence that bordered a vast, empty pasture. He moved with a steady, relentless rhythm, his entire being focused on the task at hand. He must have seen her approach the window, but he gave no sign. He did not call to her, did not issue a single command. The choice of what to do, what to be, was apparently hers, and that freedom was more terrifying than any cage. A desperate need to impose order on the chaos of her existence, to prove her worth in a way she understood, propelled her into action. She found the kitchen, a small, practical annex off the main room. It was as spare and clean as the rest of the house. Finding flour, salt, and water, her hands began to move, drawing on a memory of a life before this one. She built up the fire in the cook stove, kneaded dough for flatbread, and put a pot of coffee on a boil. The simple, domestic tasks were an anchor. In this silent, empty house, in the heart of this terrifying wilderness, she was making a meal. It was a small act of defiance, an assertion of purpose. She would not simply exist, she would contribute. When Jedediah Kalen finally came in from the cold, his face flushed from the wind, the smell of coffee and baking bread filled the small house. He stopped just inside the door, his gray eyes taking in the scene. He looked at the stove, at the plate of fresh bread on the table, and then at her. He said nothing, but in the slight, almost imperceptible softening of his jaw, she saw a flicker of something new. Not gratitude, not yet. It was surprise, and perhaps the first tentative acknowledgement of her presence as something other than a burden he had chosen to shoulder. The days bled into one another, marked not by conversation, but by the steady, silent rhythm of work. A routine formed from the space between them, a language of actions spoken across the quiet expanse of the homestead. She rose before the sun, stoking the embers in the cook stove to life, the small act a daily ritual of claiming the day. She would prepare his breakfast, leaving it on the table, and he would eat it without a word before heading out into the vastness of his land. Her world became the four walls of the house, the small patch of earth behind it, and the view from the window of his receding figure shrinking against the horizon. She learned the geography of his life through the items he left behind. The worn-out leather gloves on the mantelpiece, the faint smell of hay and sweat on the shirt he discarded, the way he left his boots by the door, caked in the mud of the lower pasture or the dust of the high plains. These were her clues to the man who was her keeper, her savior, her mystery. She poured her energy into the house, scrubbing floors that were already clean, polishing the few panes of glass until they gleamed, washing and mending his clothes with a fierce, concentrated effort. It was a way to pay her debt, a way to make herself indispensable. One afternoon, she found one of his work shirts, the fabric at the elbow worn so thin it had torn open. It was a simple, sturdy garment, bleached nearly white by the sun. She could have used it for rags, but instead, she took it to her small room. By the fading light of the window, she found her small sewing kit, a relic from her past life, and set to work. She did not patch it crudely. She darned the hole with tiny, meticulous stitches, weaving the new thread into the old until the repair was a neat, dense square stronger than the original fabric. It was an act of quiet restoration, a painstaking effort that no one would ever notice or appreciate. The next morning, she left the folded shirt on his chair. He picked it up, his gaze falling on the mended elbow. His large, calloused fingers traced the line of her stitches for a moment. He did not look at her or say thank you. But when he left the house that morning, he was wearing the mended shirt. The sight of him, a distant figure walking toward the barn with her careful work on his arm, sent a strange, warm feeling through her chest. It was a conversation held without a single word. He, in turn, began to leave things for her. A bucket of fresh milk from his single cow would be waiting by the back door in the mornings. A pile of perfectly chopped firewood would appear beside the hearth, enough for the day and night. These were not commands, but provisions. He was tending to the mechanics of her survival, and she was tending to the mechanics of his comfort. They orbited each other like two solitary planets, held in place by a shared, unspoken gravity. She watched him with the horses. He had a half-dozen of them, strong, hardy animals suited to the unforgiving land. With them, his silence transformed. It became a language of gentle touches, low murmurs, and an unshakable, quiet authority. He was never cruel, never struck them in anger. He moved among them with a respect that they returned, their powerful bodies yielding to his steady hand. Seeing him this way, seeing this capacity for a connection that was both firm and gentle, chipped away at the wall of her fear. A man who was kind to his animals, she reasoned, could not be entirely without a soul. The silence was still vast, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the clatter of pots, the rhythmic thud of his axe, the sigh of the wind, and the slow, steady beat of two lonely hearts learning to exist in the same small space. The day came when the flour sack was nearly empty and the salt was a gritty film at the bottom of its barrel. The trip to town was an unavoidable necessity, a prospect that filled her with a cold, crawling dread. Jedediah announced it the way he announced everything, with a brief, factual statement over his morning coffee. "We'll need supplies. We leave in an hour." He did not ask if she wanted to go. Her presence was assumed. He was not going to leave her alone at the ranch, a vulnerable and tempting prize for anyone who might know she was there. It was, she understood, another form of his silent, practical protection. The ride back toward the settlement was the reverse of their first journey. The landscape, which had seemed so alien and hostile, now felt familiar. She recognized the dip in the trail, the particular cluster of rocks that looked like a sleeping animal. The ranch, their isolated kingdom, was behind them, and the hostile territory of the town lay ahead. As they approached, the familiar knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, though the day was not cold. It felt like a shield. Jedediah seemed to sense her anxiety. His face, already a stoic mask, hardened further, his jaw set like granite. He did not offer words of comfort, but she felt a subtle shift in his posture, a heightened alertness that was all for her. The town was as she remembered it, dusty, mean, and judgmental. As their wagon rolled down the main street, conversation ceased. Windows were parted, curtains twitched. They were a spectacle, the silent, outcast rancher and the woman he had bought like cattle. Their disapproval was a physical force, a wave of venom that washed over the buckboard. Inside the general store, the air was thick with it. The proprietor's wife, a woman with a sour, pinched face, looked straight through her as if she were made of glass. She directed all her questions to Jedediah, her voice dripping with sanctimonious disdain. "What will you be needing today, Mr. Kalen?" she asked, pointedly ignoring the woman standing beside him. From a corner, other women whispered behind their hands, their venomous glances striking her like tiny, sharp stones. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. Then the store's door swung open, and the smell of stale whiskey and malice filled the room. Silas Croft stood there, flanked by two of his sycophantic cronies. His eyes, small and pig-like, found her immediately. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. Well, he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it ain't Kalen's expensive mare, he treating you good, girl? Or are you regretting you didn't go with a man who knows what a woman's for?" The insult hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Shame, hot and sharp, coursed through her. But before she could react, before the tears could form in her eyes, Jedediah moved. He didn't say a word. He didn't raise his voice. He simply shifted his position, placing his body squarely between her and Silas Croft. It was a simple, solid movement, an act of absolute defense. He was taller than Croft, broader, and in that moment, he seemed to emanate a cold, deadly stillness. He met Croft's bleary, hateful gaze with a look of such profound, unwavering threat that the air in the store seemed to crackle. It was a promise of swift, brutal violence, delivered without a sound. Croft, for all his bluster, was a coward. He faltered, his smirk vanishing. He held the stare for a moment longer, then spat on the floorboards and backed away, muttering curses. Jedediah did not watch him go. His task was complete. He turned back to the counter, finished paying for their supplies in the ringing silence, and then, with a firm but gentle touch on her elbow, guided her out of the store and back to the wagon. He had not fought for her honor with his fists or his voice, but with his presence. He had absorbed the town's hatred, shielded her with his own body, and in doing so, had drawn the line of his allegiance permanently in the dust. The first flakes fell without warning, fat, wet Cinderellas that melted the moment they touched the hard, cold ground. Within an hour, the sky was a sheet of churning gray, and the wind began to howl, driving a blinding wall of white across the plains. The blizzard descended upon them with the swift, brutal force of an invading army, erasing the world and trapping them in the small, solid fortress of the house. The ranch, once a lonely outpost, now felt like the only point of certainty in a universe of white chaos. For days, they were confined. The world shrank to the main room, the circle of warmth cast by the stone fireplace, and the constant, roaring presence of the storm. The silence between them changed. Before, it had been a function of distance and uncertainty. Now, it was a shared condition, a blanket of quiet woven from the storm's fury and their forced proximity. They moved around each other in the confined space, a familiar practice dance. He kept the firewood stocked, venturing out into the maelstrom in short, brutal bursts to the woodpile. She kept the fire fed, a pot of stew simmering on the hearth, filling the small space with a warm, savory scent of survival. One evening, the third of their entombment, a new sound pierced the wind's shriek, a low, distressed noise from the direction of the barn. Jedediah stiffened, listening. He rose without a word, pulling on his heavy coat and boots, and grabbed a lantern. The look on his face was one she hadn't seen before. The stoicism was still there, but beneath it was a raw edge of worry. "One of the Mares," he said, the words clipped. "She's due to foal. Too soon." He disappeared into the blinding white, a tiny, flickering light swallowed by the storm. She waited, pacing the length of the small room. An hour passed, then two. The worry on his face had transferred itself to her. It was no longer just his horse, it was their horse. Their survival was tied to the health of his livestock, to the sturdiness of their small world. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She bundled herself in every layer she could find, pulled a thick shawl over her head, and ladled some of the hot stew into a bowl. Shielding it with her body, she stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at her, stealing her breath, the snow 1,000 tiny needles against her face. She followed the faint, wavering path his boots had made, fighting her way toward the relative shelter of the barn. Inside, the air was frigid but still. Jedediah was kneeling in the straw beside a beautiful sorrel mare who was lying on her side, her breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. He was murmuring to the horse, his voice a low, soothing rumble she had never heard him use with a person. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else she couldn't name. She wordlessly handed him the bowl of stew. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing hers. He didn't eat it right away. just held its warmth in his hands. "She's struggling," he said, his gaze returning to the mare. "The cold, it weakens them." She found an empty sack and knelt in the straw a few feet away, holding the lantern high to give him more light. She didn't speak, just stayed, a silent, steady presence in the cold, tense space. They remained that way for hours, a vigil in the heart of the storm. He worked, his movements deft and sure, and she held the light. In that shared, desperate moment, tending to a new life fighting to exist, another wall between them crumbled into dust, carried away by the howling wind. The foal, a trembling, long-legged creature, was born just before dawn. As the storm finally began to recede, Jedediah looked at her across the tired, steaming bodies of the horses. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his gray eyes were clear. "Thank you," he said. The two words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of a tome, a profound acknowledgement of a partnership forged in the heart of the blizzard. The world that emerged after the blizzard was pristine and blindingly white, the landscape transformed and purified. The shared ordeal had changed the atmosphere inside the house as well. A quiet ease had settled between them, the silence now comfortable, companionable. The ranch was slowly beginning to feel less like a place of exile and more like a sanctuary. One afternoon, driven by a nascent and surprising hope, she took a spade and turned over a small patch of earth near the back of the house, where the sun hit strongest. The ground was hard and cold, but she worked until her muscles ached, preparing the soil for a spring garden she was not even sure she would be there to see. It was an act of faith, a claim staked on the future. That evening, they sat by the fire, the only light in the room coming from the dancing flames. The house was filled with the comfortable, domestic sounds of his cleaning a leather harness and her mending a burlap sack. The quiet stretched, but it was a peaceful, settled thing. He paused in his work, running a cloth over a brass buckle, his gaze distant. "They never called you by a name at that place." It was a statement, not a question, spoken so softly she almost thought the fire had just crackled. She froze, her needle hovering over the rough fabric. The past she had so carefully buried rushed back, cold and sharp. All this time, he had called her nothing at all, a silence that had been its own kind of respect, allowing her to remain undefined. Now he was asking. He was giving her a choice. She could remain the nameless girl he had purchased, a ghost inhabiting his house, or she could claim herself. She took a slow, steadying breath, the scent of wood smoke filling her lungs. She thought of the woman she had been, the girl whose name was a remnant of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. But it was hers. It was the only thing that had ever truly been hers. "Alara," she said. The name felt strange on her own tongue, a word she had not spoken aloud in years. It hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. He stopped his work entirely and looked at her, truly looked at her. His gray eyes held no pity, only a quiet, solemn consideration. He was seeing her, not as a symbol of his charity or a component of his household, but as a person with a past, with an identity. He gave a slow, single nod. "Alara," he repeated. He tested the name, his rough voice softening around the syllables. He made it sound solid, real, and then he returned to his work, the comfortable silence descending once more. But everything had changed. The next morning, as he was leaving for the barn, he paused at the door. "Alara," he said, "the fire is low." It was a simple, factual statement, but hearing her own name in his voice, used so naturally, was like the sun breaking through the clouds. It was an affirmation, a recognition. She was no longer the girl. She was not an object or a burden. She was Alara. Later that week, as they prepared for another necessary trip for supplies, he looked over her small, burgeoning garden plot. "We'll need to get some seeds in town," he said. If you tell me what you need. The words were a quiet revolution. He was asking for her opinion. He was acknowledging her creation, her small act of hope, and offering to contribute to it. She looked from the dark, rich soil to his steady, waiting face, and for the first time since she had arrived at this desolate, beautiful place, she felt the undeniable, earth-shattering sensation of putting down roots. The fragile peace they had cultivated was not destined to last. Trouble, once stirred, has a way of festering. It rode into their isolated world on the back of a rumor, delivered by a traveling tinker who stopped at the ranch to water his horse. One of the few souls who dared to treat with Jedediah Kalen. The tinker, a wiry man with nervous eyes, spoke of the talk in town. Silas Croft, his pride wounded and his hatred stoked by cheap whiskey, had not forgotten his humiliation in the general store. He was telling anyone who would listen that Kalen had stolen his rightful property. He spoke of the girl, Elara, with a crude possessiveness, spinning lurid tales of what he would do when he went to reclaim what was his. The tinker's words hung in the air long after he'd gone, a toxic fog seeping into the quiet corners of their homestead. Jedediah listened to the man's report with his usual unnerving stillness, his face giving nothing away. But after the tinker left, Elara saw the change. It was not in his words. He never spoke of the threat directly, but in the subtle, deadly shift in his routines. The rifle that usually rested on a rack above the fireplace was now always within his reach, leaning against the wall near the door. In the evenings, she would see him on the porch, methodically cleaning it, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a sharp, ominous sound in the twilight. He spent 2 days reinforcing the hinges on the barn door and fitting a heavy new bar across the inside of the house's main door. His quiet, purposeful actions were more terrifying than any verbal warning. They were the preparations of a man who knew violence was not a possibility, but an inevitability. He was battening down the hatches for a different kind of storm. The old fear, the helpless terror she had felt on the auction block, returned to her in waves, cold and sickening. But it was different now. It was no longer a shapeless dread for her own fate. It was a sharp, specific fear for him, for the life they had painstakingly built from silence and small kindnesses. She feared the destruction of this fragile sanctuary, this unexpected home. The thought of losing it, of being dragged back into the squalor of Croft's world, was unbearable. But even more unbearable was the thought of Jedediah being hurt defending it. One afternoon, while he was out checking the farthest fence lines, she acted on a new and unfamiliar impulse. Resolve. She went to the tall cabinet where he kept spare tools and supplies. On the top shelf, wrapped in an oilcloth, was an old double-barreled shotgun. It was heavy and smelled of gun oil and disuse. She carried it to the table, her hands unsteady. She had seen her father handle such a weapon a lifetime ago. With fumbling fingers, she broke it open, just as she had seen him do. She found the shells he kept in a wooden box and, with a deep, calming breath, practiced loading and unloading it until the movements were no longer clumsy, until the weight of the gun felt less alien in her hands. She would not be a damsel to be rescued. She would not be a prize to be fought over. She had been an object for long enough. When the trouble came, she would not be hiding in her room. She would be standing beside him. Her fear had not vanished, but now it had a companion, a cold, hard knot of determination. She was Elara, and this was her home. The night arrived with a sliver of moon that offered little light, leaving the plains cloaked in a deep, menacing darkness. A profound silence had fallen over the ranch, the kind of stillness that precedes violence. Jedediah had not gone to bed. He sat in his armchair, the rifle resting across his lap, his gaze fixed on the single window that looked out toward the trail. Elara sat at the table, the shotgun on the floor beside her chair, its cold, heavy stock a strange comfort. It did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They were simply waiting. The sound came near midnight, not the direct clatter of approaching riders, but the nervous whinny of a horse from the barn. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, a silent shadow moving to the door. He peered through a crack in the shutters. 3 of them, he said, his voice a low whisper. They're going for the barn. A flicker of orange light bloomed against the darkness. A torch. They were trying to set fire to the barn, to their livelihood, to the birthplace of the foal they had saved together. A cold rage, pure and clean, cut through Elara's fear. Jedediah pulled the heavy bar from the door. Stay here, he commanded, his voice tight. bar the door behind me. But as he slipped out into the night, she did not obey. She left the door unbarred, grabbing the shotgun and moving to the darkened window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw Jedediah melt into the shadows, circling around toward the barn. She saw Croft, torch in hand, and his two companions, their forms illuminated by the malevolent flame. Then Jedediah's voice cut through the night, as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Croft, drop it." The men whirled around, startled. Croft let out a drunken laugh. "Cullen, came out to greet your guests? We've just come for what's mine." He gestured with the torch toward the house. "And I'm starting with your barn." Jedediah stepped into the faint moonlight, his rifle held loosely but with lethal intent. "This is your only warning. Get off my land." The confrontation escalated quickly. One of Croft's men, emboldened by whiskey, lunged toward Jedediah. The ensuing motion was a blur of brutal efficiency. Jedediah sidestepped the charge and brought the butt of his rifle down in a sickening arc. The man crumpled to the ground with a groan. At that moment, the second man broke from the chaos, not toward Jedediah, but making a desperate, foolish run for the house. For her, time seemed to slow. She saw him coming, a dark shape detaching from the larger fight. He thought the house was an easy target, the woman inside a helpless prize. He was wrong. She raised the shotgun, the heavy barrels finding his approaching form. Her hands shook, her breath hitched, but she held her ground. She thought of the auction block, of the leering faces, of the utter powerlessness. Never again. She pulled one of the triggers. The roar of the shotgun blast was deafening, a physical blow that ripped through the night air. The kickback slammed the stock in her shoulder, a brutal, shocking pain. She hadn't aimed at him, but at the ground just to the side of his running feet. The dirt erupted. The man screamed, stumbling backward and falling in a heap, utterly terrified by the unexpected, violent resistance from the dark house. The sound of the blast momentarily stunned everyone. In that instant, Jedediah closed the distance to a distracted Silas Croft. The fight was short, ugly, and decisive. When it was over, Croft was on the ground, disarmed and beaten, his remaining conscious crony dragging him away into the darkness. Jedediah stood for a moment, breathing heavily, and looked toward the house, toward the window where she stood, the scent of gunpowder clinging to her. He couldn't see her clearly, but he knew. They had defended their home, together. In the aftermath, a ringing silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Jedediah retrieved the fallen torch, plunging it into the water trough with a hiss that seemed to extinguish the night's violence. He limped back to the house, a dark stain spreading across his shirt sleeve. Alara met him at the door, the heavy shotgun still in her hands. She set it carefully against the wall, her shoulders screaming in protest, and looked at the blood on his arm. The fear she had held at bay now rushed back, transformed into a sharp, focused concern. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He glanced down at his arm as if just noticing the wound, a deep gash from a knife he'd taken in the brawl. "It's nothing," but the way he favored it, the tight line of his mouth, told her it was not nothing. She lit another lamp, her movements suddenly sure and steady. The adrenaline had been replaced by a clear, urgent purpose. "Sit," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. To her surprise, he obeyed, slumping into the chair at the table while she fetched clean water, cloths, and the small bottle of carbolic acid he kept for the animals. The roles were now completely reversed. She was no longer the fragile dependent, but the capable caretaker. With gentle, practiced hands, she cut away the torn, blood-soaked fabric of his mended shirt. She cleaned the wound, her touch firm and efficient, ignoring his sharp intake of breath as the acid stung the raw flesh. He watched her the entire time, his gray eyes unreadable in the lamplight, but his stillness was a form of trust. As she bandaged his arm, her fingers working deftly to tie the knot, the mundane intimacy of the act settled in the quiet room. It was the touch of a partner, not a servant. When she was finished, She slumped into the chair opposite him, the night's exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the window, painting the room in soft shades of gray. The world outside was peaceful, as if the brutal fight had been nothing more than a bad dream. Jedediah looked from his bandaged arm to her face, then to the shotgun leaning against the wall. A new expression entered his eyes, something beyond respect, something deeper. It was awe. "You were brave, Ilara," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. She simply shook her head, unable to find words. Bravery felt like too grand a term for the cold, hard necessity of her actions. "I was not going to let him take this," she whispered, her gaze sweeping the small, humble room. It was no longer just his house. It was their home. He reached across the small wooden table, his large, uninjured hand covering hers. His palm was rough, calloused from a life of hard labor, but his touch was incredibly gentle. It was not a gesture of ownership or even of comfort. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken equality, a partnership sealed in silence and confirmed in violence. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. The sun was rising now, its golden rays pouring into the kitchen, illuminating the floating dust motes and catching the weariness and wonder in his eyes. She looked past him, out the window at the vast, rolling plains. The landscape that had once seemed a desolate prison now stretched before her as a kingdom of possibility. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, born from the dust and the fire, quiet and resilient and real. Theirs.